Welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. This is Mara and Ben. Last time we talked about doing horror in D&D. Today we're going to be talking about comedy. I had one campaign in particular that was a particularly grimdark kind of setting, and I wanted to give my party a break from it. So they came to a chamber, and in this chamber there was a door with a rope across it. There were a bunch of buttons on the wall. Each button had a picture of some kind of food item. A mug of ale, a loaf of bread, a honeycomb, a wheel of cheese, and a few others. And on the wall was also written a poem about a full and rich meal. In Thieves' Cant, hidden in the message on the wall, was something that told the party that if they pressed the right button, the door would open. The party first attempted to open the door through non-magical means. Barbarian took a swipe at the rope with his axe. Nothing doing, they couldn't open it. In addition to these things, along the wall were statues. The dwarf barbarian pressed the button for ale, hoping that it would in fact get him an ale. And that was not the right button to get through, so the result was that the statues came to life, attacked the party. When the party defeated the statues all reformed back on their pedestals, ready to go for when the party pressed the wrong button the next time, which they did again and again. So it wound up being kind of a grueling slog until finally the party, more or less by accident, landed on the correct one, which was the wheel of cheese. And the party were getting into these long philosophical discussions about, well, maybe the honeycomb, because that's the rarest item, or, we want to break the rope and you break bread. They were really, really into it. They finally pressed the button for the wheel of cheese, and a blade appeared from above, cut the rope, and the door opened. And I informed the party that they were, at this point, going to realize that the cheese depicted was, in fact, a very sharp cheddar. At which point, there was the groan you would expect. Somebody actually looked at his watch. By the way, who wears a watch anymore? Anyway, somebody looked at his watch and actually said, that was an hour-and-a-half long dad joke.
Yes. Now, one of the most important things to keep in mind when doing any kind of comedy is not to do the very cheap kinds of puns, but to do proper build-up and payoff, and, well, that's...
I feel extremely attacked, but go on.
Yeah, I mean, many dad jokes are kind of puns, but you did do the good build-up, and there was payoff, which was at least amusing to one person at the table. But it's very similar to a horror in that sense. And in fact, I'd say that if you look at a comedy movie versus a horror movie, again, depending on what kinds of movies you're looking at, you'll find some of them have very similar pacing. It's actually kind of weird, but The Great Dictator, a truly ancient movie by this point in time, I've watched a few times, and it actually has a surprisingly similar pacing to some of the later Aliens movies, which they aren't true horror, but the point still stands, which is that there are some similarities there which you wouldn't expect. Another great example I like to use is a game called The Sinking City, which if you look it up you won't be able to find it because it got copyright striked. But The Sinking City, you play the game from the viewpoint of a just utter sociopath, and it comes across very much like the Sherlock Holmes TV show, where it adds this magnitude to things, and things can be much more horrifying because a more sociopathic mind and a more analytical mind isn't going to be afraid of the same things that your average Joe might be afraid of. But it also provides this strange look into what's amusing, really, and it makes things which you would never really think of as funny seem funny, because that person can go, oh wait, this doesn't make any sense, which is kind of hilarious. It's a bit like why the Joker is also so funny.
In comedy and horror, just as you said, I think what they really have in common is that it comes down to an unexpected result. In the case of horror, it's something that frightens you. It's you turn the corner and there's the big scary monster, or you hear the child calling for help and the child is a vampire. Something like that. Whereas with comedy, it's more you've set something up to be serious and then it just turns out to be goofy, as in the example that I gave. A couple of things that are really important to do with this. One of them is that you obviously don't go too overboard with it, and don't make it any one joke too permanently a part of the campaign. I think this is going to become kind of a theme of the video, but it's an important one because we've run into it so many times. I had a NPC, a goblin named Shank, that joined the party and became kind of the party's pet for a while. And, it was a goofy, funny goblin. The goblin got drunk, the goblin got stoned, the goblin did all kinds of weird stuff. But it did kind of run its course fairly quickly.
Yes, and I had some mixed feelings about Shank, because he was funny at first, but I find that with one-note characters especially, you really just run into the issue where it's like, okay, we've seen this 6 times from this one person, not even from other people or not even with a new perspective. And honestly, it's my biggest complaint about D&D as a whole right now is that a lot of the races, just on face value from their lore and such, are designed to be kind of one note. It's part of the reason why I'm glad that we're starting to see some major divergences from that, with D&D and Wizards itself saying alignment doesn't matter anymore, and with things like the Gith having a duality to them, which allows for a lot more depth here. And it could be actually very interesting how much more humor you could squeeze out of that, especially as the definition of humor within the party and to the character changes. Whereas if you have a character whose personality and attitude towards the world stays exactly the same, no matter how much you like that character at first, it's going to get a little obnoxious.
Yeah, and with Shank, what I did was, after a certain amount of time that he was with the party, I had the party have a friendly encounter with a group of goblins and hobgoblins. Shank actually sort of led them to the rescue, but that's neither here nor there. And then it was left up to the party whether he would continue to accompany them or whether they would be moving on without him. And the party decided that he would be moving on without him. So it gave the party a chance for the joke to be over. It gave the party for a chance to say, okay, DM, thank you for that. That was fun. But we're on to the next thing now.
Yes, and another thing to keep in mind, as we showed at the beginning of this piece, is not to have the build-up go on for too long, because that can damage how funny the joke is, and can really just make people more frustrated than amused in the end. It's actually a bit similar to horror in that way. A game that I sung the praises of in our horror video was Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which I love, but I personally have never finished, and I know a lot of people in the community who love that game but can't finish it because it makes the same mistake. It builds up this suspense for the next scare, but it never delivers on it. Like, it takes half the game for the first jump scare to happen, which is a little too much buildup. It becomes physically unpleasant when you know that something is about to happen, but it never does happen. And it applies for comedy, too. Think about it. If someone goes up to you and starts telling you the build-up to a joke you've heard a dozen times before, listening to that again is physically painful on some level. So you have to be really careful about that. You can, again, mitigate this problem by either having new jokes, because they're a little less at risk, or by just cutting out some unnecessary meat in the middle.
The way this is done really well would be in the movie The Princess Bride. I think a big part of the reason why that movie is so beloved, even though it's objectively pretty goofy, is that every joke has a serious part either right before or right after it, or both. When he wrestles the giant and has his sleep well and dream of large women, there's a very tense moment where you think he might have killed the giant, and where the character is very concerned about it, very clearly concerned about it. But then he tells his little joke, and the music starts up, and it's a sign that everything's fine, we're moving on. And that's really important to setting up the joke, is you have these serious moments. So you have the serious build-up, then the joke, then the serious build-up, then the joke. You can get a lot of jokes in that way, as long as you, as I say, time it right and have a situation where it doesn't just turn into a SpongeBob episode where it's an endless series of ridiculous jokes. And speaking of endless series of ridiculous jokes, a character who I and nobody else absolutely love, Mara already knows who I'm going to talk about. I've mentioned him on this channel before, was my second character I ever played, a bard named Alnarin, who everything he said was in rhyme, and 90-odd% of what he said was insulting another member of the party. It's a great character for a one-shot, but in a long-term campaign, again, it's one note. It gets old. It gets tiresome. And in the same way that murder hobos do, you figure if you're doing a one-shot, having that character who just kicks in the door and slaughters the guards, like, that keeps the story moving. It can be fun. But if you're in a campaign where you're trying to really build up relationships within the world, between the characters, and so on and so forth, it just goes sideways. It just gets tiresome. It's why We Be Goblins is a one-shot and not a long-term campaign.
Yes, and this is going to feed into what I'm about to say next, but it's also, you have to keep in mind what you're playing and how it allows for a bit of growth so that you don't end up having sort of stale jokes or repeating a lot of the same territory. It's part of the reason why I don't like to play elves older than about 150, is because while that's extremely young for an elf, I find that most elves in popular fantasy portrayed as being over 200 tend to be incredibly rigid in their ways of thinking, and they do not change often. This applies for most races, though it'll be a little more difficult to find exactly when in their lifetime that happens. With humans, it's more like 60s and 70s, but it's definitely there for 90% of the races. The Verdun are an exception to that, or not Verdun, but they are a shape-shifting race and shape-changers as well. They can they're fluid, and so are their minds, basically. So that really allows for a lot more. Verdun, that's what I was thinking of. And that feeds into this next point, which is that serious campaigns really don't work with horror or comedy alike. You have to be very careful to make sure that your characters can grow, especially in long-term campaigns. Both Ben and I have abandoned characters in the middle of a campaign just because we got tired of the fact that they stayed exactly the same for an extended period of time, though that can be on the DM, depending. But you really have to keep in mind what your setting is. I don't think that comedy characters who are one-note have to be strictly limited to a one-shot campaign. There are certainly campaigns I've played in which had a joking theme throughout. Again, we love to praise the session zero. You really have to talk about it there.
When your character can have a gimmick or a joke or something about them that is funny, that just can't be their whole entire personality, backstory, and every moment of roleplay. There have to be other things about them that will make them interesting and compelling. Otherwise, it just gets into campaigns that run for months or years. It just gets, we've heard this joke every week for the last 6 months. Could you please do something else? Which brings me to the note that I'm going to end with, which is whatever kind of humor you do, make sure your party's comfortable with it. Make sure that anything that involves race or gender or sexuality or gender identity or sex, or even something as simple as, if you like a lot of bad puns, somebody might find that really grating. Somebody might it might make them want to get up and leave the table. So make sure that with whatever it is you're doing, that it is something that the other players are comfortable with, that everybody's going to have a good time.
And to expand on that, on my end, as my final thoughts, keep in mind the mood of the table. That's going to change from session to session, so your session zero won't be a blanket solution to that. Your very funny, if slightly inappropriate joke might be fine one day, but then if someone's had a breakup or something, it might be problematic the next. So just be sure to read the room, especially with comedy, as it can come across very offensive. With that, we hope you enjoyed this video and found it perhaps helpful in building in or removing comedy from your campaigns. Next time, we'll be covering how to build Loki to level 10.